Now, if you don't have an external renderer to do your renders of your assets, don't worry because we can do our shots directly within Substance Painter. In this lesson, we'll simply do a viewport render utilizing the post effects. We began the project by setting the document size to 2048, so the first thing we'll do is upsize the entire texture set. So under the texture set settings, we can change the size to 4K. What this will do is recompute all the channels to the newly upscaled version. Now keep in mind that these size parameters are independent from texture set to texture set. So we'll have to go to the leg set and do the same thing. So we'll just switch to the leg set and change the size to 4K. And keep in mind, I'm also only doing this at render time. I usually don't paint at this resolution. I'll go ahead and just close these other windows so we can focus strictly on the rendering process. Next, we'll go to the viewer settings and just ensure that we have an environment map that you like. I'm using the glazed patio environment map. Also note that you cannot actually place physical lights within the viewport. Everything is lit within this environment map. So just rotate the environment to somewhere you can show off the model as best you can. Make sure shadows are enabled, and I'll also change it to intensive computation and just adjust this opacity slightly to give it more contrast. Under shader parameters, we have options for AO intensity, which will allow us to darken occluded areas of the mesh. And I'll usually change my quality settings to high. Next, we can head over to the display settings. We can first adjust the camera. So I'll choose a lower number for the FOV, which will give it more of a orthographic projection, something around 35. Let's activate the post effects, which will give us a ton of cool controls to make a nice render with. First, I'll enable anti-aliasing, which will get rid of any jaggy lines in the render. We can apply some color correction to this scene. So for example, if I want to saturate the colors a bit more or desaturate them, I can do that. So I'll just bump mine up slightly. There's also your standard brightness and contrast controls as well. Let's turn on DOF, which is short for depth of field. Now this is tied to the focus distance and aperture up by the camera settings. So when we play with the focus up top, we can begin to focus our camera on a specific part of the model. To see this effect a little bit more, I'm going to turn up the aperture and then play with the focus distance to get the focus where I want. Now this might be a little bit difficult to play around with, so instead what we can do is pressing Control and middle mouse button on the area that we want the camera to focus on. So I'll control middle mouse click on the front, or we can focus on the antenna ball or the knee guard. But for now, let's just keep the focus on the front, and I'll just dial down the aperture slightly. We also have the ability to do some tone mapping, so I can turn that on, and we can adjust the exposure and gamma settings if things are a little bit too dark or a little bit too blown out. Just to keep things a little bit more tidy, I'm going to collapse these other ones that we played around with. Next is our glare setting, which will bloom out areas of the render. So if we lower the threshold, which means more pixels will bloom out, we can start to see the effect clearly. And just adjusting the luminance to really blow out the shot. I'll usually start out like this and adjust the shape. Now there's a lot of cool shapes that you can choose, like horizontal streak or cheap lens. And what this is doing is just giving it a lens effect on the bloom. And I think I'll stick with the cheap lens effect on this one. And what I'll do is just adjust the values after I've got everything set to make it a little bit more subtle. So now that I've got some glare on the scene, everything's looking a little bit too blown out, so I'm going to go back to the tone mapper and just adjust my settings slightly. Now to show the vignette feature a little bit better, I'm going to go back to my viewer settings and adjust the environment opacity and give it a slight blur. So now when I go back to the vignette, we can see that it darkens edges of the viewport, which is a nice way to frame your shot. And lastly is the lens distortion, which will allow you to do a fisheye type of effect. And I'll just disable this for now. When you're happy with your settings, we can start taking some shots. For example, let's go to the leg area, control middle click to focus on the leg, rotate the light slightly to get a nice angle, and just hit tab to go to full screen mode. Now there's no screenshot button in the viewport, so for the time being you'll have to hit print screen. Let's take a shot of the front portion. So I'll hit F to frame the mesh, control middle mouse click to focus, and move my light around. This time I'll change my camera rotation to a free rotation. Now this can give me some more unique angles that you might not get using a constrained rotation. So I'm just rotating around to get a good shot, and always adjusting my interactive focus as I go. And now just changing the light a little bit and lowering the aperture for my final shot. Now keep in mind that you can always paint and texture with all these parameters set on your post effects. So in the next lesson, we're going to finish things off by doing our final eye ray render.